Welcome back. We're going to finish Chapter 12 in our Cooper and John textbook, and we're going to look at things like trade and how the government might actually attempt to control that, as well as look at how the government intervenes in labor markets. Some of our objectives for this video will be to look at the source of gains from trade across two different countries. If you recall, we looked at that in chapters 4 and 6. We're going to look at why governments might put restrictions on trade across borders, how they do it, and then we're going to look at how the government gets involved in the labor markets, both in terms of general restrictions, in terms of migration, and then in terms of taxes. Let's first look at trading. If you recall, countries trade because of a thing called comparative advantage. This means that when two different parties, in our case we're talking international trade right now, so two different countries, they will have a different set of skills and abilities. They will be good at different kinds of things. And because of that, each country can specialize in the good or service that it can produce at a comparatively lower opportunity cost than the other country. Specialization occurs because of the difference in the cost of the opportunity cost between countries, and these differences usually arise from something called technology, and that's essentially the knowledge and managerial skills that are used in the production of goods. Now let's just look at an example. This example is in your book. I'd like to just give a little caveat here and say that I don't recommend that we promote the sale or the consumption of beer, but your book had a great example for you, and we're going to carry that forward. Now we're looking at two different countries, Guatemala and Mexico. It takes Mexico 2 hours of labor to produce 1 kilogram of tomatoes and 2 hours of labor to produce 1 liter of beer. Guatemala is less efficient in both goods. It takes Guatemala 6 hours to produce a kilogram of tomatoes and 3 hours to produce a liter of beer. In other words, Mexico has absolute advantage in producing both tomatoes and beer, but in terms of comparative advantage, the opportunity cost for Mexico to produce 1 liter of beer is 1 kilogram of tomatoes, because it takes Mexico 2 hours to create either of them. Guatemala's opportunity of cost of producing 1 liter of beer is half a kilogram of tomatoes. Well, right there, we can see that it costs Guatemala only half a kilogram of tomatoes to make a liter of beer, whereas it costs Mexico 1 whole kilogram of tomatoes. Looking then at producing tomatoes, we see that Mexico's opportunity cost of producing 1 kilogram of tomatoes is 1 liter of beer, and Guatemala's opportunity cost of producing 1 kilogram of tomatoes is 2 liters of beer. Clearly, Guatemala is not as efficient at producing tomatoes, because it costs them 2 liters of beer. Mexico has the comparative advantage in producing tomatoes because it only costs Mexico 1 liter of beer to produce a kilogram of tomatoes. And Guatemala has comparative advantage in producing beer because it only costs it a half kilogram of tomatoes to produce 1 liter of beer. Now your book works you through some different combinations, let's just say in a 36-hour work week. Assuming Guatemala and Mexico decide to trade, Mexico and Guatemala could both specialize in tomatoes, and together they could produce 24 kilograms of tomatoes. And that's because in a 36-hour work week, Guatemala could produce 6 kilograms of tomatoes, and Mexico could produce 18 kilograms of tomatoes, and that's how we get to 24 kilograms of tomatoes. If they both chose to specialize in beer, Mexico could produce 18 liters of beer, and Guatemala could produce 12 liters of beer, which would get both countries, if they specialize in beer, 30 liters of beer. Or Mexico could specialize in tomatoes and produce 18 kilograms of tomatoes, and Guatemala could specialize in beer and produce 12 liters of beer. Or there are multiple other combinations, and we see all of them graphically on this production possibilities frontier. This is if both countries specialize in tomatoes. This is if both countries specialize in beer. That's where they intersect on the two axes. And then along this frontier are all the different combinations of Mexico's and Guatemala's production, assuming they trade. Now, if they choose not to trade, and they each just do their best at what they could do alone, notice they are both worse off. They each have not achieved the greatest efficiency, which would be somewhere on the production possibilities frontier. It'd be inefficient not to trade. Now, let's say you're convinced by that argument. Why on earth would governments ever want to restrict trade? That means they would be forcing their economies to produce and consume somewhere lower than the production possibilities frontier. And we would say, based on all of our theory so far, that that would be a bad idea. Well, sometimes there's not entirely great economic policy happening. There's something else happening. So first of all, what we've just proven is that in the theory of comparative advantage, when two economies decide to trade and specialize in their comparative advantage, the economy as a whole is better off. However, in reality, there are going to be some groups who are worse off. Examples might be lower skilled workers in developed countries like the United States are often finding themselves competing for jobs against the lower skilled workers in developing countries like China, who have much lower wages. Lower skilled workers in the United States, thus, are not always better off when we trade. Though, according to our theory, the economy as a whole in the United States is better off when we trade. Now, why else might governments restrict trade? Well, political lobbyists. You've heard of these kinds of companies or even individuals. They may secure benefits for very powerful groups. In the United States, there are subsidies on sugar. Why? Well, in part because the United States government, again, likes to make sure that it keeps farmers in business, but also because the sugar farmers have hired very powerful lobbyists who have managed to secure ways to restrict trade. Now, why else might the government want to restrict trade? I'm assuming the first thing that probably popped into your mind was something called a sanction or a ban or something called an embargo. Let's take, for example, Cuba. You've probably heard that you can't go to Cuba directly from the United States, that the United States will not trade with Cuba, and that's in part because the United States is attempting to use an economic policy to achieve a political end. Same thing with Iran. In recent years, we've seen that the United States and Iran have engaged in certain kinds of talks, and then the talks shut down, but overall, the United States will not trade with Iran because the United States is attempting to achieve a political end. This is a sanction or an embargo. Now, we also have bans because of either health and safety reasons or other economic reasons on certain products that the government would like to restrict. So, for instance, raw milk cheeses are not always allowed to be sold in the United States because of the potential health risks. Another way to restrict trade, and we don't see it happen a whole lot in the United States these days, is something called a quota. And those are quantity restrictions. Those are quantity restrictions on imported goods. Meaning, let's say it's foreign-made autos. In the United States, we will actually restrict how many foreign-made autos can be sold in the United States. And usually this is done to protect certain domestic industries. Lastly, we have something called a tariff, and that's simply a tax on imported goods, usually designed to protect certain domestic industries. Let's look a little more deeply at quotas. What are their implications? This is when we restrict the quantity of an imported good. It will raise the price on those imported goods. Once again, we're going to restrict quantities. You know we're going to have to raise the price then. It will increase demand for the substitute goods, whatever those are, that are made domestically, and that will raise the prices on those also. And when it comes to a quota, it's just a quantity restriction, so the government receives no revenue. Let's look at this graphically. We have two different markets here. This is the market for foreign cars. And this is the market, this graph is showing the market for domestic cars. Let's say that the government decides it wants to restrict the quantity of foreign cars because it wants to protect domestic car makers. So it decides to insert a quota into the market, which creates a quantity that is less than the equilibrium quantity, if you see here. We're, of course, going to have a dead weight loss right here, as we always do when we restrict quantities. We see that the buyer surplus, because the price has now gone up at this level, this is the new price, right? So price has gone up for foreign cars. We see that the buyer surplus, because the price went up, has gone down. But seller's surplus, all the sellers of foreign cars are pretty happy because their surplus has gotten bigger. Now let's look at the market for domestic cars. Because there are fewer foreign cars available in the market, well, we're going to see a shift out and to the right of the demand curve for all domestic cars, because those are the substitutes. Unless you think bicycles are the substitutes, let's assume that domestic cars are probably a natural substitute for foreign cars. Well, now people want more of them. This was the equilibrium quantity right here, but we're going to see that it's going to move higher as the demand curve shifts out. This will also cause the price of domestic cars to increase. So quantity and price of domestic cars will increase while the quantity will decrease in foreign cars and the price will increase. Now let's look at tariffs. These are taxes on imports, remember, and they're usually designed to protect certain domestic industries. What are the implications? Well, in this case, the price paid by domestic buyers will be greater than the price received by the foreign sellers. Because of the tax or the tariff, buyers will be paying more than sellers are receiving. As in all tax situations, the quantity traded will be less than the equilibrium quantity, which will lead to a deadweight loss. But unlike a quota, in a tariff situation, the government will collect revenue, and that will be at the rate of imports times the tariff rate. Let's look at that graphically. If the government decides to put a tariff on a particular imported good, we'll see that this is the price that the foreign sellers will receive, whereas this is the price that will be paid by the consumers, and this in here is going to be the revenue that the government receives. This, of course, is the deadweight loss caused by the fact that equilibrium quantity is much greater. We now have a lower quantity that is being traded in the market. Now let's shift gears and let's look at the labor market. Sometimes, as we have seen in previous chapters, the government may step in to the labor market. Now, one of the things the government sometimes does is require licensing. For instance, in order to practice law, you have to pass the bar and you have to be admitted to the bar, and this is a legal thing. To practice medicine, you have to be licensed. To be a public accountant, you have to be licensed. To work with medical records, you have to be licensed. To be a nurse, you have to be licensed, and the list goes on and on. The government does this usually because they're trying to protect consumers. They believe that consumers don't know how to tell a good doctor from a bad doctor, a person who knows how to practice medicine versus one who doesn't. So the government steps in and acts in sort of a paternalistic manner, if you will, and determines who is and who is not qualified to practice certain things. The government might also choose to have migration restrictions. Now, this does not happen in the United States, or doesn't happen a lot in the United States in terms of moving within the United States and being able to work. However, some countries do actually restrict the movement of their workers even within the country. Your book gave you the example of China. Now, what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about migration? Well, we believe that workers will move to areas with higher wages unless the government restricts them or the area is unattractive. Now, if the government has not decided to place restrictions on the movements of workers, then the only reason a worker might not move to an area with higher wages is if the area was unattractive. However, that comparatively unattractive area, let's just say, I don't know, New York City is unattractive, whereas maybe to you, Northeast Pennsylvania is very attractive. So you won't necessarily move to New York City for higher wages unless employers in New York City are willing to give you what we call a compensating wage differential. And all this is a fancy 3-word phrase to say that the wage will be even higher. There will be a differential that compensates you for the fact that you have to live in an undesirable location. Now, I gave you an example of Northeast Pennsylvania and New York City. This is common in, for instance, the mining industry. A lot of mines, copper mines, zinc mines, even diamond mines, or other mining operations are often in highly remote locations where most men and women don't want to move because they're not close to a school district or their church or whatever. So sometimes, in order to get workers out to those jobs, the employers will operate at a compensating wage differential. Now, let's just look graphically at what can happen in a situation. I believe your book gave you Portugal and France. Now, it was assumed that Portugal was the more attractive place to live, and France was less attractive to the workers. If France decided to raise their wage up to 16.07 euros, then what we would find is Portuguese workers would be willing to move to France. So, in Portugal, looking at the first graph on the left, the labor supply would contract. It would get lower, which means the labor supply curve would move back into the left. And that's because Portuguese workers would be leaving Portugal to go to France, where the labor supply would be expanding at exactly the same amount that the Portuguese labor supply was contracting, because those workers are moving in order to get the higher wages. Thus, in this graph, what we see is there will be a lower supply of workers in Portugal, but a greater supply of workers in France. Now, the only reason those workers were willing to move from Portugal to France was because the wage rate was higher. But notice, as I move the labor supply curve out, what was once a wage at equilibrium at 16.07 euros has now been pushed down to a new equilibrium wage. The supply has expanded, so the new equilibrium wage is actually going to settle at, check that out, the exact same equilibrium wage which will be occurring in Portugal because of the contraction in labor supply. So what ends up happening is what we call a harmonization or an equalization of wages. This happens because, in general, we have to deal with supply and demand curves, and as the labor supply contracts in one economy, that pushes the wages up, and as the labor supply expands in another economy, it pushes the wages down, so that we see an equalization of wages across borders. Now, one other way that the government can step into the labor markets is to impose an income tax. Well, the way most individuals receive their income is by working, and so this is like saying it's a tax on work. What are the implications? Well, the wages received by the employee will be less than the wages that are actually paid by the employer. In general, if the real wage of an employee is less, we will assume that employers will want to supply less labor, meaning the quantity of labor supplied to the market will actually be less than the equilibrium quantity. We'll have a deadweight loss because of the market inefficiency, but in this case, it is a tax, so the government does receive revenue. How is that tax burden shared across the sellers of labor, or the workers, and the buyers of labor, the employers? Well, it'll depend on the wage elasticity of labor supply and labor demand. Let's look at it graphically. In this example, we see that because of an income tax, the wage received by the worker is much lower than the wage that was actually paid out by the firm, and the difference is going to be the tax that gets paid in the form of revenue to the government. The firm's surplus, or what we call the buyer's surplus, will have been decreased, as will the seller's surplus or the worker's surplus, and that will be both because of the tax revenue as well as the deadweight loss in the economy. So taxes, income taxes specifically, cause a deadweight loss. And we talked at the beginning of our first video on this chapter about how every time there's a trade restriction of some sort and a deadweight loss of some sort, we might be encouraging a black market, or what we call an underground economy. Income tax is no different. Income tax laws, first of all, are rather hard to enforce. I know we all have this image of the mean old IRS man, but it turns out it's actually really hard to enforce an income tax. Misrepresentation of a person's income is quite common, and the underground economy is a great workaround. For instance, some employers may choose to pay employees under the table, in other words, pay them in cash, so that the employee doesn't have to report the income and the employer doesn't have to report that the income was paid. The employees can still, in some cases even, still claim to be unemployed if they're being paid under the table, and if they had been receiving unemployment benefits, they can continue to receive those. There are other reasons the underground economy continues to work. For instance, it's not just income tax. It may be because of outright illegal goods. I think we all know well and good that there is an underground economy for illicit drugs, for instance. It may also be happening because some people choose not to exchange cash. They might barter goods and services for other goods and services. And because no money is exchanged, businesses or even individuals choose not to report. In other words, it's a no-cash deal. Are there other ways the underground economy can work? Yes, there are. And most, however, are a result of trying to avoid some sort of government intervention in a market. As Christians, I think we can quickly understand that there are major ethical issues to creating an underground economy, though we could probably see why economically we might want to do so. I trust that this has been at least an eye-opening way to understand what might be happening in government intervention and why we might be tempted to engage in black market or underground economic transactions.